Leden van het college van bestuur, collega-hoogleraren, geachte aanwezigen. Gaarne heet ik u van harte welkom in deze openbare zitting van de Senaat van de Rijksuniversiteit Groningen. Vanmiddag wonen wij de oratie bij van Dr. R.A.J. Mees, benoemd tot hoogleraar in de faculteit Economie en Bedrijfskunde met de leeropdracht Practice of Business Ethics, oftewel praktijk van de bedrijfsethiek. Een oratie is de reden waarmee een nieuwe hoogleraar zijn of haar ambt officieel aanvaardt. Het is de gewoonte dat de oratie wordt voorafgegaan door een korte laudatio, waarin een daartoe uitgenodigde collega van de nieuwe hoogleraar de orator introduceert. Dat wil zeggen, ons iets zegt over diens leven en loopbaan. Voor de introductie van collega Mees geef ik graag het woord aan Dr. B.P. de Bruin, hoogleraar in de faculteit Economie en Bedrijfskunde met de leeropdracht Financiële Ethiek. En ik verzoek collega Mees aansluitend zijn oratie te houden.
Members of the board of the university, distinguished guests, dear Roland. It is a great pleasure and honor to address you today and to present a short laudatio. A laudatio is a short public speech in praise of a new professor giving an inaugural address, typically including some biographical elements. Mid-1980s, Roland completes 2 academic degrees, one in mathematics from the University of Utrecht and one in business administration from the Rotterdam School of Management. With these 2 degrees in the pocket, Roland is exquisitely positioned to start a career in finance. First at ABN, soon merged and called ABN AMRO, then at ING with a brief stint at Triodos, and then at ING again. Roland's impressive CV spans more than 30 years in the Dutch banking world. In the first years in the industry, Roland's work is preoccupied with tasks one should expect a mathematician to enjoy working on, such as work in the bank's data center and the integration of foreign payment infrastructures of 2 merging banks. Over the years, Roland moves into territory that positions him well for the professorship, the start of which we are celebrating today. The years at Triodos, for instance, expose him more intensely to ideas of sustainability, but it is while working at ING that Roland decides to pursue academic studies in a fully different direction, philosophy. Studying alongside his work at the bank, he manages to complete a program resulting in a master's degree from the University of Utrecht in 2010. Nor does it end here. Rather, this is only the start. For his master's thesis, Roland had chosen the topic of intergenerational justice, one of today's most difficult and pressing social challenges, and squarely in the domain of sustainable development. And it is sustainability that becomes the topic of his next academic accomplishment as well, his doctoral dissertation. A successful defense at the University of Utrecht in 2017 completes this next step. All this alongside a full-time career in banking. The responsibilities at ING and the academic work at Utrecht mutually reinforce each other. Roland's preoccupations become more and more integrated on the topic of sustainability. Perhaps a defining moment was the adoption of the Paris Agreement by 196 parties to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change on 12 December 2015. As you probably all know, the aim of the Paris Agreement is to hold the increase in global average temperatures to less than 2 degrees, preferably less than 1.5 degrees, as compared with pre-industrial levels. Unlike many people in business and academia, Roland sees this Paris Agreement goal as a personal goal, that is, as a personal responsibility. It is, Roland believes, too easy to outsource responsibility for climate change mitigation to the state or to international organizations. For we have a personal responsibility just as well. But it is often, Roland observes, quite difficult to bring our lives in line with these responsibilities. Roland's contribution to addressing this challenge are twofold, one academic, one in business. At ING, Roland develops a so-called sustainability-linked loan. This is an innovative product linking the interest rate on a loan to the degree to which the client manages to improve their sustainability performance. Starting in April 2017 with a €1 billion syndicated loan for Philips, today the total volume of sustainability-linked loans amounts to more than €500 billion. As to his academic contributions, in his recent monograph on sustainable action and motivation, Roland examines the obstacles human beings have integrating these personal responsibilities in their lives. And he faces the challenge head-on. No postponing this to later generations. No diffusion of responsibility to states that have not contributed to global warming. What Roland calls humanity's challenge is a challenge for us, people living in affluence. We have to act. Roland, we at the Faculty of Economics and Business are happy and honored to have you in our midst. You integrate the practice of sustainability in research and in teaching, exactly the way that business ethics should be conducted. Welcome to Groningen.
Leden van het college van bestuur, zeer geachte aanwezigen. What does the number 2426 mean to you? Probably nothing. The number 2426 is the number of days from today, 12th of May 23, until the 1st of January 2030. In other words, we have 6 years, 7 months, and 20 days to reduce our climate footprint by 50% if we want to achieve the goal of limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. The task for humanity is thus very concrete. A 50% reduction in our climate footprint by 2030, compared with 2019 levels, if we want to keep alive this scenario of limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees by the year 2050. This means that a business or organization can only morally justify a commitment to achieve net zero by 2050 if it also commits to achieving the intermediate milestone of minus 50% by 2030. If we want the aim of limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius, then we should want the means of achieving the 50% reduction by 2030 without free riding on the efforts of others. So, we have 2,426 days left to take enough sustainable action to fulfill our duties to future generations and keep the planet livable for them. This is the moral challenge facing humanity today. By signing the Paris Agreement of December 2015 and bringing it into force, humanity, as represented by the United Nations, has committed to taking decisive and coordinated action on a global scale during this decade, 2020-2030. The Paris Agreement's concrete, science-based reduction target of minus 50% by 2030 presents us, the current generation, with the most serious collective action problem in human history. The lack of robust action since the 1992 Earth Summit in Rio de Janeiro proves that humanity is at a crossroads. Either we take enough sustainable action, or we accept the consequences of our inaction, which means that global warming will happen, as climate science has predicted. Ever since the first United Nations Climate Summit, it has been acknowledged that the affluent countries should take the lead in mitigating climate change. these countries have committed to providing the developing countries with financial help to meet their obligations under the agreement, as well as the costs of adaptation to the adverse effects of climate change. Approximately 1 billion people inhabit this group of affluent countries, all of which are constitutional democracies. They also belong to the high-income OECD countries, which indicates that their inhabitants, in relative terms, live a long and healthy life, are well educated and have a decent standard of living. All of this gives this group of affluent countries special moral status in the debate about who ought to take climate action. Indeed, I would go as far as to say that the task of meeting the climate challenge relies on the actions and motivation of individual and professional people in these countries. This group of countries and their inhabitants is the moral community I wish to address in this lecture. I will start by reflecting on the moral practice of business. By this, I mean the way in which people in organizations act, take responsibility, and further the purpose of their organization. Next, I will demonstrate the incompatibility between this practice of business and our inaction, our refusal to take responsibility when it comes to taking up the climate challenge in the affluent countries. I will then ask how we should consider our failure as business professionals to meet the climate challenge. Surely, it raises fundamental questions about the moral integrity of people in the affluent countries. In my response, I will elaborate a few institutional policies that we could and should support as responsible citizens in the affluent constitutional democracies. However, before I continue, I should raise another question. What is the contribution of ethics to the problem of taking sustainable action? Isn't this mainly a political question, or a question for the empirical sciences, such as psychology or economics? As I see it, the main contribution of ethics lies in the integration of knowledge as provided by the empirical sciences from the observer or third-person perspective with the first-person perspective that people have on their action. People's experience of their own action forms an integral object of study that includes cognitive, emotional, and volitional aspects. Ethics does not consider these elements in isolation. Ethics is interested in people's struggle to succeed with actions that contribute to the climate challenge as seen from their own point of view. The integration of empirical third-person knowledge into the first-person perspective enables us to defend sustainable policies and measures to others, that is, second-personally, who have similar reasons for action, for example, our colleagues in business organizations. How do we understand ourselves within the practice of business organizations? While remaining true to the extensive literature on institutions as entities in their own right, I want to emphasize that businesses consist of human persons who occupy organizational roles. Business organizations are composed of people who are in an ongoing discourse with each other about their strategies, policies, and actions to further the goals of the organization. What the organization in fact entails is intersubjectively shared among the members through an ongoing discourse between them. All actions commonly ascribed to an organization are in fact carried out by representatives. Professionals work according to shared role descriptions, or at the very least, a personal interpretation of such descriptions, to which they can be held accountable in the light of the purpose of the organization. Understanding organizations as minimally individualistic, however, does not imply that the responsibilities of organizations can simply be reduced to individual responsibilities. Businesses are entities that can be held accountable retrospectively and can assume prospective responsibility. They can enter contractual relationships, buying and selling, issuing shares, and incurring debts for which they are liable. However, actions taken by the organization always occur through people who represent the organization in responding to the stakeholders. The prospective responsibility of businesses also works through human individuals. My understanding of organizations as being composed of human individuals implies that people ascribe to each other a form of autonomy. Such autonomy is based on two characteristics. First, it follows from the concept of an organization that people work to realize its purpose, at least as they understand it. Professionals expect one another to contribute within the context provided by the organization's features, for example, its mission, strategy, structure, systems, and culture. Consequently, it is presupposed that people possess the skills necessary to perform their role. At least, it is presupposed that those skills can be learned. What are basic professional skills? Organizations are founded on the premise that employees can practically deliberate, commit themselves to a plan, execute the plan, and evaluate what they have achieved. We thus necessarily attribute a certain form of autonomy to members of an organization in carrying out their role or task, without which cooperation in organizations seems inconceivable. Second, being a member in an organization is not a matter that remains fully external to a person. Of course, employees receive external goods from the organization, for example, salary, position, workspace. More importantly, however, over time, employees develop the internal goods that allow them to increase their excellence within the practice of the organization. Their capacity to contribute to the organization's purpose is gradually extended, for example, by becoming better, more experienced machine workers, musicians, or sales managers. Being a member of an organization thus delivers the internal good of contributing to one's ideal of a good life. That is, in our ideal of a good life, our work in organizations somehow plays a role. Hence, although there can be numerous situations in which working in organizations will be far from perfect, we must acknowledge that it enhances our capacity to develop and pursue our ideal of a good life. Since the 1980s, the question has been asked, what do excellent organizations do differently from other organizations? One of the views that emerged from this question is the notion of the visionary company. I picture a visionary company as what I would call a value community. A visionary company consists of people who have been selected and who have themselves chosen to adopt the company's core set of values and its overarching purpose. This idea of visionary companies strongly deviates from classical management theories. These companies do not seek to control the behavior of their employees using hierarchy, a high division of labor, separation of planning and execution, and detailed job descriptions. The visionary company's core values are self-evident truths that are authentically believed and that provide guidance and inspiration to the people inside the company. For example, product quality and reliability, and excellent customer service. The purpose entails the organization's fundamental reasons for existence beyond just making money. Both the core values and the purpose have intrinsic value and importance to those inside the organization. Visionary companies work towards their purpose within the condition of plurality, instead of prescribing the way their employees should behave and carry out their work. These companies understand that communicative action is necessary for strategy formulation and for realizing change in the organization. Communicative action is understood here as a continuous conversation in which the validity claims of the participants can be criticized by the other participants at any time. To conclude, business organizations are composed of people, people who are in an ongoing discourse with each other and who build the organization together. The practice of business shows that value-driven companies that are founded on the autonomy, intrinsic motivation, and high degrees of freedom of their people deliver the best performance to their stakeholders. This means that people working in high-performance organizations must integrate their role as a professional with an understanding of themselves as practical human beings. Such integration entails being able to morally evaluate one's different roles as against an integral set of normative standards. What people do in their professional role and what they do as a private individual or in another organizational role must be integrated within their overall conception of themselves as a person. What is the relevance of this account of the practice of business for our reluctance to take climate action? Based on my minimally individualistic understanding of the concept of organizations, I understand humanity as the totality of human beings presently populating the Earth. The task of meeting the climate challenge is therefore not assigned to humanity understood as an abstract entity, but it is a task for each of us currently alive. In addition to the roles of individual citizen and organizational professional, human beings occupy a third role. This is a role that they must evaluate from an overall understanding of themselves as a person. It is the role of being a member of humanity. Being human means that one is part of humanity. Since we must consider ourselves members of humanity, integrating this role into understanding ourselves as a person means that we cannot disregard the obligation of humanity to safeguard its own existence through meeting the climate challenge. I have already mentioned our obligation to morally evaluate our different roles as against an integral set of normative standards. It follows, therefore, that the duty to mitigate climate change also affects our roles as individual and organizational people. It would be normatively incoherent if we were to accept that we must do something about climate change in our role as humanities members, while simultaneously disregarding this duty in performing other roles. This means that we need to answer the question of how humanity should be organized to assume its responsibility to meet the climate challenge. In the high-income OECD countries, there is a principal-agent relationship between voters and politicians. In their role as members of humanity, people in the affluent countries have ordered their representative politicians to sign and ratify the Paris Agreement. This implies that politicians who have been given the authority to propose and implement plans for reducing greenhouse gas emissions and who fail to do so can be held accountable and can be the subject of moral criticism. On the other hand, in such a case, the delegation of responsibility and powers from the individual voters to the governmental institutions does not discharge individual citizens fully of their responsibilities. With or without responsible politicians, the problem of acting on the climate challenge remains. If delegation to the agents doesn't work, then the responsibility to act sustainably falls back on the principal, that is, the individual citizen. This means that if delegation to politicians fails, individual citizens are likewise subject to moral criticism. Citizens in the high-income OECD countries cannot, therefore, waive their responsibility for failing to achieve the goal of meeting the climate challenge. In summary, people in the affluent countries, on my analysis, can only evaluate their roles as individuals, professionals in organizations, and members of humanity as against an integral set of normative standards if they assume some individual responsibility for taking up the climate challenge. What will be the effect on us should this misalignment of our roles as individuals, professionals, and members of humanity continue? To answer this question, I will look at the consequences for our moral integrity. Integrity is a capacity to respond to change in one's values or circumstances, a kind of continual remaking of the self. It is also a capacity to balance competing commitments and values, and to take responsibilities for one's work and thought. Integrity understood in this way means that there certainly is a connection between living with integrity and living a morally good life. Integrity is an aspect of character that serves to link or dissolve diverse goals, values, emotions, aspects of self, and periods in one's life. Moral persons can be justifiably held responsible in at least 3 respects. First, they are responsible for intentional aspects of their action. Second, they may be responsible for incidental aspects of their actions of which they should have been aware. Third, they may be responsible for at least some of the reasonably predictable effects of their actions. If we separate or compartmentalize our commitments in our individual and professional roles from commitments related to future generations, that is, in our role as members of humanity, it can be argued that we can be held responsible for such separation. Compartmentalizing our commitments regarding current people on the one hand and future people on the other, by not evaluating them as against an integral set of normative standards, leads to a divided self. People who do so deliberately close their minds to certain possibilities for action, which could be expected of them in both their individual and their professional roles. I conclude that our integrity is at risk if we consistently do not care for the distant future whilst living an active life as a moral person. Persistently not living up to our obligations to take up the climate challenge negatively affects the circumstances in which people will live. It also casts doubts over us, current people, when we still believe that we can be regarded as persons of integrity. Striving for a sustainable world entails being able or willing to find good reasons and make the commitments needed for voluntarily carrying out actions to meet the climate challenge. Persistently failing to do this will hamper us in viewing ourselves as candidates for consideration as persons of integrity. Can we see any signs of hope that we could still meet the climate challenge? First, we must cherish the institutional framework of constitutional democracies, a system of legislative, executive, and judicial powers based on a constitution and the right of citizens to vote is the best way to organize society to meet the climate challenge. Based on my argument that citizens bear responsibility for taking climate action, this means that if politicians fail to act or act incorrectly, voters have an obligation to give them another mandate or elect other politicians. Second, the European Union has committed itself to the most ambitious plan to date to meet the climate challenge. The Fit for 55 ambition refers to the EU's target to reduce net greenhouse gas emissions by at least 55% by 2030. The package includes, among other things, emission reduction targets of the member states, a social climate fund for the most vulnerable groups, improving the energy efficiency of buildings, and measures to increase renewable energy within the total energy mix. Third, some recent developments in the Dutch legal context are encouraging. According to the recent updated Corporate Governance Code, the aim of listed companies is to focus on sustainable, long-term value creation. Directors of listed companies must consider the impact of the company's actions on people and the environment and weigh up the interests of stakeholders. While the code is an example of soft law, it will do its disciplining work in the courts. This also applies to the unwritten standard of care of the Dutch Civil Code. The ruling by the District Court of The Hague in the case of Milieudefensie versus Royal Dutch Shell shows that practical ethical considerations have entered the courtroom in support of the argument that taking insufficient climate action is a tort. I will conclude my lecture by addressing three major groups of people. Dear academic researchers, given the urgency of the climate challenge, I believe that we need more than ever the perspectives that multiple academic disciplines offer. As we go through the eye of the perfect moral storm, it may not be the right time to start designing grand theories. Instead, as we have seen during the recent pandemic, we scientists need to bring a consensus view that is solid and clear enough for policymakers to lead the way towards meeting the climate challenge. I will put forth my best efforts to contribute through real-world ethics to the goal of helping others shape their actions and policies in a normatively sound way. Dear students, you are the next link in the chain of generations, and the climate challenge will increasingly preoccupy your work. In my capacity as a teacher of business ethics, I will offer all the help I can for the tasks you will face. My objective will be to ensure that my students are able to perform empirically informed, conceptual, substantive reasoning to help resolve morally problematic business action situations and are able to act according to their moral judgment. I will facilitate and empower you to assume your role as an integrated, responsible citizen who continues with meeting the climate challenge. I strongly believe in moral education as an effective institutional policy to mitigate climate change. In this regard, I consider it my role to help you develop your moral compass. Dear colleagues of ING and the financial world at large, from the moment I started studying philosophy, which eventually resulted in this professorship, I have experienced enormous support from my employer. I will maintain a constructive, critical lens on what is going on in banking and finance, bringing banking and business practice to academia, bringing academic research to finance professionals. In all my roles, I will continue with my commitment to change banking and finance from the inside. With just 2,426 days left, we need to step up. We also need to be aware of increasing ambition levels. What we consider up to standard today will not be sufficient as against the standard of tomorrow. Climate change is entering the tenors of our loans. Climate risk is turning the business cases of our clients upside down. Not contributing to the mitigation of climate change is now a risk that bankers will have to assess. The sustainability-linked loan was the right thing to do when we initiated this product in early 2017. It set a trend in the loan markets and later in the bond markets, which is unstoppable. The Loan Market Association and the International Capital Markets Association have rapidly developed principles and guidance for borrowers and issuers. However, having implemented this nudge, we should go on to take more significant steps and cooperate with the regulator with a view to make banking regulation on climate change practicable. This should lead to establishing a level playing field. As part of the Banker's Oath in the Netherlands, we promise to make every effort to improve and retain trust in the financial sector. It means that the moral function of banks, of extending credit to businesses and households, should be considered in relation to our common obligations to future generations. To change the financial sector from within, we need a stronger commitment than just acting sustainably as individual citizens, in the sense of eating less meat, commuting by public transport, taking fewer flights. Such stronger commitment is what I would call a second-order commitment. It entails a strategic or political capability to resolve situations of organizational inaction or stalemate. When acting on a second-order commitment, the existential question is, am I prepared to do what is required of me to reach a new equilibrium in the relationships with stakeholders? This second-order commitment, which is required in the 2,426 days that are left, means committing to overcoming the motivational difficulties and institutional obstacles, whatever it takes. Ik heb gezegd.